Let's just dial this back to the word diet then.
About 80% of dieters are unsuccessful and they gain their weight back, specifically because they follow some guru who says everybody's got to do my diet. That's a big red flag.
I'm with you on that. Today's guest is Alan Aragon, who's a very experienced practitioner with a couple of decades working with actual real clients. And he's also a research scientist, having published a lot of papers, including with me.
What you want to look for in what somebody says is you have to individualize your diet. How unsexy is that, though?
We get into the topic of nutrition and how that can impact body composition, how to differentiate quality from flawed science, and in particular, how to spot the red flags that you'll find out there on things like social media.
We as humans, we have a tendency to want to know what is the single best universal way I need to do this. Simplify it for me. The answer is, look, it's your personal damn preference. I'll simplify it by saying...
Welcome to Fueling Greatness, and I'm especially excited to introduce my guest today, who is Alan Aragon. Alan, how are you doing, mate?
I am doing fantastic. Thank you so much for inviting me on, Laurent. It's been years, or I don't know, decades, who knows. It's all a blur, but I'm very happy to be here. Thank you.
It's been too long, is what it's been. I guess listeners might not be sort of understanding what it is we're talking about, because this is a new podcast. But I'm not new to podcasting, because I've been podcasting for ages on an audio only podcast called We Do Science. And you have graced the airwaves many a time on that podcast, where we've got into all things evidence-based and body composition and so on. And so it goes today. We're going to have a chat about body composition and diets and evidence-based practice, perhaps. We'll see how much time we have to get into this. So before I get into what it is that I was hoping we would talk about today, how about you give us a little bit of background as to who you are, what you've been up to over the years, and why it is that you're so passionate about this topic. Diets, body composition, nutrition generally?
All right. That's a huge question. So I would say my role within the past decade is research. So all aspects of it, from reviewing others' work to collaborating with other researchers and doing our own original investigations, as well as meta-analyses, systematic reviews, narrative reviews, randomized controlled trials, all of that stuff. I've been fortunate enough to have been invited on many research projects. And so what we do is we collaborate and we try to get our findings out to the public. So mainly to the fitness space, practitioners who are involved in body composition related goals, performance related goals, fitness and wellness, health related goals as well. The areas of concentration are protein, training, protein and training. And a big interest of mine and a lot of folks in the space is just how to become more fit, better body composition, and how to live well for as long as possible. So yes, that's been my role for the last 10 years as research. And then just prior to that, the 20 years prior to that, I've been a practitioner in the space with both the personal training side on the first decade and then the second decade with nutritional counseling. And I was just on a podcast recently. It really bothered me when the host is like, okay, so I realize that you're a research guy, and I'm like, I'm a research guy, but I've been in the trenches for 20 plus years. And he had no idea. He thought I just got together with a few scientists over the last few years and cranked out 30 papers. I'm like, good heavens, man, I need to let people know that I've worked with real people for 20 years. So yeah, a little bit of an intro and a rant there for you, Laurent.
Do you know, I like an intro of all sorts, and I particularly like a good rant, Alan. And you deserve to. I mean, obviously, I've known you for, I've known you for a while, and I've never known you any other way, to be honest. Look, yeah. I really like talking to you for lots of reasons, and one of the reasons why I like talking to you is because you love this stuff. It's your life, it's your passion. I mean, I honestly don't know how you have any time to yourself, frankly. I mean, I think I'm pretty obsessed with my work, but I mean, you make me feel like I'm just do this on the side. I've been following you for a long time. In fact, we met, I mean, it must be 12, 13 years ago, something like that, at an ISSN conference, I think. We're of a similar age. We're on the sort of the grey hair brigade of our industry. And I think what I've always liked about your work as an educator, as somebody who disseminates knowledge is that you come from a really practical, applied perspective. One of the reasons why I like that is because, a bit like yourself, I've come from a similar-ish background in as far as I've been a practitioner for an incredibly long time. Before I was, quotes unquote, a proper practitioner, as I like to think of myself now. I used to be a PT and all sorts of things in my really young days that I could barely remember. It's terrible. It's been that long. And all the lessons that have been learned over time that you do not see reflected necessarily in the textbooks, in the papers that we read as solutions to the problems that I've been trying to deal with for years, and myself personally. I mean, like most people that have a real interest in things like nutrition, sports nutrition, is because we like this stuff ourselves. We try and apply these things on ourselves. We've had our challenges, some more than most, and this shit really matters to us. So that is reflected in your work. And you've published papers over the years. I've got one here in particular, which is your diets and body compositions paper. You were very grateful to include me in a very small way on that paper. And a bit more recently, you've gone to producing your book here, which is, as you can see, look, it's all bookmarked and it's all been ready and it sits on my shelf. I love this book.
Thank you.
But you've got this interesting blend, Alan. Before I wanted to get into the sort of the meat of today's conversation, look, not everyone appreciates how much effort it is to write a paper, particularly a consensus paper, of which you've contributed to numerous consensus papers, all sorts of peer-reviewed publications over the years. I think before we get into talking about diet, nutrition, and so on, why have you labored, and I know it's a labor of love in many ways, that hard at producing things like peer-reviewed publications when you're not the traditional sort of scientist in an ivory tower?
That's a good question. I feel really grateful that I get invited to write these things. And so when the guys at the top invite me to collaborate, I just feel like, wow, all of the time I put in to this is all the time and effort is finally getting validated, vindicated. And so it's an opportunity for me to kind of close the circle and put a stamp on history as far as pieces of work that have a profound benefit to the community, locally, globally.
Yeah.
And so I see it as just a huge opportunity to put my knowledge and my skills to actual use. And so it's just something that I feel like it's a gift. I'm taking this gift and I'm doing the best that I can with it. And so it kind of reminds me of this quote that I have no idea who said it, but it goes something like this. And I saw it on a Bill Phillips Body for Life documentary, like 20 years ago or something like that. So what we have, our lives, is a gift from God, and what we do with it is a gift to God. So yeah, I invoked God within the first 15 minutes of our podcast here. So it should only get more profound from here.
I can also imagine Bill Phillips is going to somehow end up on the screen here, and we're not going to be fueling greatness. We're just going to be doing Body for Life. So, well, look, listen, Alan, look, you do a lot of podcasts, and you get to talk about this stuff a lot. Like I mentioned, you're very passionate about this, but what you have to say, and this is why I'm interested in talking to guys like you, guys and gals that have very much an evidence-based background, particularly, look, for us as nutritionists, I don't know about you, one of the things that I have to deal with in the real world is you go to a dinner party or have drinks or whatever, and somebody says, hey, what is it you do? And that's the first problem, is you don't know who I am. You do not know who I am. But the main thing is you've got to answer, I'm a nutritionist. And then they're like, I need to lose a bit of weight, or my kid is playing soccer or rugby or whatever. What advice do you have to give? How, that title of I'm a nutritionist, there are different people have different perspectives on the value that job title seems to have for them. Some people find that they're like, they're proud to be a nutritionist. Some people are frightened to be a nutritionist. Some people are thinking you're a quack, you're a whatever. When somebody asks you that question, Alan, how do you feel about it? And what do you normally answer?
Okay, I still have a small handful of clients, but I've been removed from the full-time role as a practitioner for the last 10 years. So I have a tendency to identify myself as a researcher and educator. So, there's almost no more dirt left underneath my fingernails. So, I have a tendency to kind of identify with that role rather than the actual counselor, which I once was for many, many years. And so that even confuses people even more, unfortunately. I should probably go back to telling people I'm a nutritionist, come to think of it. But I'm really sensitive to how the general public and what they're trying to tell you when they ask you this question. Because a lot of times when you talk to people in gatherings, they find out what you do and who you are. And if you're in the fitness and wellness space and nutrition, they almost automatically try to impress or ingratiate you or get you on board with the idea that, hey, I'm on your team. I kind of know what I'm doing, and I've been studying this stuff. So people will tell you immediately, hey, I've been cutting out gluten. I've been I only have a 8-hour eating window. I intermittently fast, or they'll say, hey, I've cut out white rice. I no longer eat white rice. That's good, isn't it? And things like that. And they try to get you on board and get you on their team. And it's a real challenge to sort of just nod your head and not sort of stop the conversation before it even starts. Because I think as practitioners, we realize, and as science people, we realize that the general public doesn't even have the basics of science literacy, or they don't even have the basis of what constitutes strong evidence versus weak evidence versus like embarrassing evidence. And so we kind of just start from the beginning and look at the context and see whether it's even worth going into that. And sometimes I just go, that's good. You're finding out what works for you. And that ultimately is what we need to do. And then if the conversation goes a better direction, then they start asking me specific questions about, hey, what do you think about X, Y, or Z? But it almost always begins with them trying to impress me by saying, hey, you know what? I cut out this particular food. And so Yeah, it kind of goes from there. It's an interesting conversation, and the way that I like it to go is the questions, because then I can see that they're interested in actually learning something. And when they're interested in learning something, then you better sit down and clear out some time, because I can talk about this stuff all day.
I'm with you on that. And it's a challenge. And unless you're a nutritionist or a doctor or whatever, and people ask you that question, you really, you might not have the full consideration of just the pressure that puts you under at that time. And I think particularly as nutritionists, you're going to meet a lot of people who have opinions. They have strong opinions. They have thoughts and ideas that to them may be facts that you may not view as facts. But either which way, they have a view and a perspective, and they can be very offended if you disagree with what they have to say, or if you shoot down, the whoever their superhero is that gave them that information. It can be a really difficult one. And I say that as somebody who works primarily with elite athletes, elite football players, and in particular of late, but in many different sports. And they're the same, athletes are humans just like anyone else. They've got friends, they've got wives, siblings, whatever, and girlfriends, etc. And they want to believe in what they're going to believe in. And I find that particularly interesting, is this concept of belief and just how powerful belief can be. Because ultimately, belief can enable you to change your behavior. Belief can enable you to do some very difficult things that we are requiring from our clients, from our patients. And if they don't believe in what you're asking them to do, it can be very difficult to achieve those outcomes that we're aiming for. But therein lies some of the problems, because of course your beliefs might be in things that are based on maybe flawed science or no science at all. Or it might be very good science, but it's not relevant. It's that piece of information is particularly valuable to a college basketball player, but has absolutely no relevance to an Olympic pole vaulter, for example, or a pro basketball player even. So when you view this as a practitioner, as a human being, but also as a researcher, you are in a really good place, Alan, I think. And that's why I like your perspective, because you're able to consider these different angles. You're not necessarily going to be a purist from a scientific perspective, because of course practice is an art. It's not just a science. But the science informs what we think, what we say. But we still have to have a pragmatic, practical view on these things. Otherwise, people aren't going to, put anything into practice. So from your research papers, from your books, you've had to draw upon evidence. It's not just something that you have a belief in because it sounds cool or trendy, or it's what your wife is into, or I believe that she probably follows your recommendations, I would hope. Yeah. How do you navigate that in terms of the evidence that exists out there? Bearing in mind, the audience here, you guys are going to be anything from students of some science, could be personal training, strength conditioning, sports nutrition, but you're also probably a sort of a ambitious recreational athlete, an elite athlete. When somebody like me and Alan are trying to give you a piece of advice, it's not just a random opinion or something that we believe in. It comes from somewhere. So Alan, where does your advice, your recommendations come from?
Typically a research basis for it. And that's with keeping in mind that there's still a lot of gray areas in the body of research. And so if I get a question related to that gray area, I will position my answer such that the person knows that, okay, in my observations, or we can speculate that. And so I always try to position things that way. Otherwise, if there's a strong and deep and rich body of evidence on a particular topic, in the research literature, then I'll go there. So I'll just give you an example. Online, I get a lot of questions. I was just hired on as the chief science officer of the Nutritional Coaching Institute, which is a juggernaut of a company. They started really recently in 2017, and they're likely the fastest growing educational body in the space. But in any case, they handpicked me to essentially red pen their content and remodel their courses from scratch. And they could have picked anybody to do it in the world, and they picked me. So I'm super honored and privileged to get that role.
That's awesome. Yeah.
Oh yeah, thank you. They know I'm extremely OCD, and I'll catch all the little errors and stuff. So yeah, it's going to be a journey remodeling all of their courses over the next few years. But it's given me a chance to be a part of their Facebook groups where new coaches and experienced coaches come in there and they ask nutrition questions. And a handful of them are unaware of who I am and what my background is. And so they just know I'm one of the admins. And on a recent post, somebody asked the question of, do I count all the protein in my diet, or do I count just the animal proteins, the classically high quality proteins? And I said, yes, you count it in. Count all of the proteins. And then somebody came in and said, I disagree, because collagen is an incomplete protein, and you should really only count the complete proteins in the diet. And this would also translate to vegetable proteins and things like that are lower quality. Collagen would fall in that category. And I said, okay, that's an interesting take, and I understand the rationale, but I disagree with you. But let's start with the practical aspect of this recommendation. What are your list of proteins that you would not count in with the total? And then where would you count them? How would you classify them in a tracking scenario? Would you allocate them into the carbohydrate allotment, the fat allotment, some combination of both? So A, tell me which proteins you wouldn't count in the total. And 2, tell me how you would count them into the big picture of the intake. And so he realized that, oh goodness, that's a good question. And that really complicates things if I were to come up with a list of proteins I don't count, because now I have the dilemma of, do I impinge upon carbs or fats or both? And then so he said, okay, he backed off a little bit and said, okay, but can I at least get you to admit that if somebody had a protein allotment of 150 grams a day and they hit their 120 grams, would you agree that filling in the final 30 with a collagen protein would make this 150 inferior to, let's say, if they filled it in with something else, some other high quality protein that's not considered incomplete? And I said, well, number one, I think you're underestimating and not giving collagen enough credit when you look at the literature where it's compared head to head with other proteins. And number two, there's literature showing that 50% of protein intake from collagen, if you're talking about RDA intake, it fared just as well from a nitrogen retention standpoint as an RDA amount of protein from a mix of sources. And secondly, there's an interesting literature, which some people have some contentions with, showing superior effects of collagen when it's compared head-to-head with whey supplementation. So A, I think you're underestimating collagen. And then B, if we were to look at the literature on a completely plant-based diet, 100% vegan diet with an omnivorous diet, now we're on 2 studies now showing that if you consume 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight, it doesn't seem to matter whether you're comparing a completely vegan diet with an omnivorous diet, as long as the protein total is optimized. And even when you look at the essential amino acid content of the vegan group versus the omnivorous group, they have significantly lower EAA content, but they're still gaining muscle size and strength at the same rate as the omnivorous group. And so there's been some recent challenges to our traditional thinking that just because a traditionally deified protein source has a higher EAA content per gram and may even elicit a higher muscle protein synthetic response per dose compared to some plant protein. When you put it in the context of the whole diet and you run the experiment with a resistance training program, so far we haven't really been able to detect the inferiority of the vegan diet as long as total daily protein is optimized. And then there's some margin for critique with those studies, of course. We can say, well, we didn't really look at highly resistance trained subjects in one of the studies. And then in the other studies, they introduced creatine, which potentially presents an element of confounding or noise in the whole picture. And they just should have left it out so we can just look at the protein differences. But nevertheless, this person was unaware of the current state of the evidence on A, collagen, and B, vegetable proteins, how they stack up to animal proteins. And amazingly, Laurent, he did not get emotional that he was unaware of these things. He said, oh, wow, that's really interesting. Tell me more. And so I was happy to see that, because in the majority of conversations you have with people, when you challenge their pre-existent beliefs, they feel this blow to the ego. And then it goes bad from there.
Yeah, I mean, look, I've heard you speak over the years. I've had the same conversation with you over the years. I know you find yourself in these spats, and you're probably thinking, oh man, what did I get into this conversation for? Because you are dealing with people who, sadly, the best way I have to explain this is that you're not going to insult them by saying you're ignorant, but they are ignorant of their own ignorance. They do not realize the limitations of their own knowledge. And that's where I was coming from with this thing about, you're at a party, you're at a dinner table, you're having a conversation with somebody, and we're using words like proteins, fats, carbohydrates, calories. So we've got this thing like, hey, we're on a level playing field because we're speaking the same language. The problem is there's shared language, science, bro science, whatever. There are similarities, and it's not until you have much more knowledge, particularly that has gone through the rigor of the scientific process. You've actually done your masters or whatever, done some research, have an appreciation for what is involved in this, how to actually read a paper, actually the whole paper, differentiate a terrible paper from a great paper, or like I said, maybe a great paper, but it might be an irrelevant paper. But it takes a lot to get there. And having a conversation with somebody, whether it's a student or somebody across the table at a dinner party who doesn't get that, can be a real challenge. And I think that that's one of your skill sets, certainly in how I see you communicate, podcasts or conferences or whatever. You are going to come across people who have different beliefs. Now, I think the thing that people find harder to deal with is when there are other scientists who have opinions based on research. So they have a good rationale for why they're saying what they're saying, some of whom are, very well-known scientists and so on. And there will be differences of opinion, and you're in the same boat. I know that you have differences of opinion with certain people who will be on this podcast when we're talking about protein, for example. But of course, you guys are much closer to each other in terms of what you believe in and why you believe in what you believe, as opposed to that bro over there. How are we supposed to deal with this stuff? Because it adds to the noise, and it makes people think, oh, well, these guys don't know what they're talking about.
I want to cover that question with a couple different topics. So the first one would be, well, maybe three different topics. So let's talk about total protein, protein dosing and distribution to maximize the anabolic response. And then I had a real interesting experience with trying to explain metabolic adaptation to the lay public as well as the practitioners in the space, the academically inclined in the space. So with total daily protein, myself and other researchers, and even the cream of the crop in the space, like Stu Phillips, for example, we agree that there's the cake and then there's the icing on the cake. So the cake would be hitting somewhere in the neighborhood of double the RDA. And then anything beyond that is kind of a gray area of the literature as far as whether we're really getting any meaningful benefit beyond that in terms of muscle growth. So what I think the conversation, where the conversation gets really interesting is that while there's an abundance of literature looking at eucaloric or maintenance conditions and hypercaloric or surplus conditions showing somewhat of a ceiling effect of 1.6 grams per kilogram of protein per day, we don't nearly have the same body of literature looking at the effects of different protein intakes beyond the 1.6 grams per kilo in hypocaloric or dieting conditions. And we certainly don't have this body of literature looking at highly trained or athletic subjects who are already lean and putting themselves in hypocaloric conditions. Because currently, the body of literature on that is mainly observational, and it does show benefits of higher protein intakes. And there's the body of literature by Joey Antonio and his colleagues that are showing things like recomposition among resistance-trained athletes who you just simply increase the protein intake from a baseline of roughly 2.0 to 2.2 grams per kilogram all the way to 3 grams per kilogram of body weight and beyond even. And you're just seeing favorable things happen body composition wise when you just kind of go very high protein with that group. And that is an icing on the cake area. I think observationally we can be pretty safe to say in the physique athlete realm, they do see benefits beyond 1.6 grams per kilo, all the way to like 3.3-ish grams per kilogram of body weight consistently, at least observationally. And so, like I said, with academicians on the total daily protein thing, we can all agree on the big stuff. And then there's the icing on the cake that we disagree on. So that's the first topic. The second topic, protein dosing and distribution. For the longest time, as you know, we had this assumption that muscle protein synthesis maxed out at around 20 to 25 grams of protein per dose. And this was based on just a repetition of studies looking at a low volume of resistance training prior to the protein dosing. And it wasn't really until 2016-ish where there was a comparison of 20 versus 40 grams of protein post-exercise, and we saw a higher muscle protein synthesis response with 40 grams of protein because we finally tested a high-volume resistance training bout that apparently created a larger sink for anabolic potential with a larger protein dose. And then we started looking at older individuals and how they had potentially an anabolic resistance kind of barrier to these lower 20 to 25 gram protein doses, where they actually saw a ceiling effect of protein intakes in the 35, possibly higher, 35, 45, 50-ish grams of protein, where the anabolic ceiling would occur in these older individuals. And this was seen with Park and colleagues' work where they're comparing 35 grams versus 70 grams of protein and actually seeing a greater effect of 70 grams of protein when you're looking at slower digested proteins in older individuals. But of course, there's this huge gap between 35 grams and 70 grams. And there's also a repetition of studies showing this anabolic ceiling occur right around the 35 gram mark. And then you have possibly Moore et al.'s work showing that the acute or short-term anabolic ceiling appears to be somewhere between 0.4 to maybe some of the upper outliers, 0.6 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight when you're looking at single protein doses that might maximize the anabolic response. And so in imperial terms, that comes out to about 0.2 to maybe 0.25 grams per pound of body weight, where you see this maximal muscle protein synthesis response. Okay, so now we've been settled for a while on the idea that maximizing the anabolic response per protein dose appears to be somewhere between 0.4 to 0.6 grams per kilogram of body weight. Now, what happened recently with Jorn Tromelin and his colleagues, they kind of cast further doubt on that because they compared a 25 gram protein dose with a 100 gram protein dose post-exercise and saw that the 100 gram protein dose outperformed the 25 gram protein dose for raising muscle protein synthesis over a 12-hour period. And so a lot of the influencers and practitioners in the space interpreted that study as saying, oh, damn, well, it looks like we need to consume 100 grams of protein post-exercise if we want to maximize our gains. But the glaring limitation of that study is they didn't include an intermediate dose in the comparison. And this intermediate dose, let's say somewhere between 30 and 50 grams, or even 40 and 50 grams, that has been repeatedly seen to be the anabolic ceiling in previous studies that lasted longer than 24 hours. So if I was on the collaboration team with Jorn et al., I would have said, look, let's please include an intermediate dose so we don't have to deal with just endless amounts of critique that we didn't have the intermediate dose in the study. So that's the glaring limitation there. Mallinson and colleagues coincidentally tested two 30-gram doses post-exercise 4 hours apart, compared it with two 60-gram doses post-exercise, and this was two resistance training bouts in the day. And they saw that 30 grams of protein not only was on par with the 60 grams of protein post-exercise, but to a statistically non-significant degree, the 30 grams of protein outperformed the 60 grams of protein post-exercise. So we're seeing here, once again, a repetition of this apparent anabolic ceiling of 30-ish, possibly 40-ish. Maybe if you're big enough, 50-ish grams of protein that maxes out the acute anabolic response. Yet, you have practitioners saying, well, look at Jorn Tromelin's study showing 100 grams outperformed 25 grams. So it's confusing as hell. And it's especially confusing when the researchers themselves are putting out potential implications that blow the paradigm. But then we have to go back to really the basics, the basic hierarchy. What is the most high impact? What is the most profound factor in protein intake? And that's total daily protein for the day. If we can all agree that you get 95% of your results from nailing total daily protein, then great. We can quibble about the final 5 to 10%, which is the dosing and distribution pattern, which is a far secondary concern to getting the total in. And so from that standpoint, I think all academic folks can agree that getting your total daily protein in one dose per day is probably not going to be optimal. I think we can also agree that if you want to maximize muscle growth, then getting your total daily protein in let's say 2 doses for the day It's probably not going to maximize muscle protein synthesis through the day, through the week, through the month. Okay, how about this? How about 3 doses in the day? So you can at least position one close to the waking period, one close to the pre-bed period, and one somewhere in there within a couple-ish hours of the training bout. Okay. In a mixed macronutrient diet, there is a very protracted time course of muscle protein synthesis of the protein doses. If you're looking at mixed meals and you're not looking at just consuming whey by itself. So therefore, I think we can all agree that the beginning of maximizing muscle growth as far as protein dosing and distribution goes, I think we can all agree that we need at least 3 protein doses in the day if your number one goal in life is to get as much muscle mass as quickly as possible. Now, whether 4 beats 3 protein doses, whether 5 or 6 beats 4, I don't know. We'll probably never know that. But it's probably a very small margin of advantage beyond 3 protein doses per day. With elite level athletes, I would just push the optimal. I would say, hey, let's go 4, and then at least, and let's not take any chances. Let's pull out all the stops towards optimal adaptations and employ all the theoretical tactics of timing and distribution and stuff. But with the general public and with the recreational athletes, the weekend warriors, if all they can do is get 3 doses of protein in their day, and they're not even doses, they're quite skewed, but they're hitting the total, then that's what we need to focus on. So that's topic number 2. So topic number 3, trying to explain metabolic adaptation. Oh my goodness, is so complicated, Laurent. And just looking at the literature, there is not even a consistent agreement on the definition of metabolic adaptation to dieting. Some researchers include things like the physical adaptations to dieting, like lowered total daily energy expenditure due to a lower body mass, lower cost of movement. And some people include physical adaptations also with respect to the lowered metabolic cost of a lower amount of lean body mass just at rest and during exercise. And so some people just limit their definition of metabolic adaptation strictly to changes in resting energy expenditure, which can happen for a number of reasons. And yet other researchers limit their definition of metabolic adaptation to so-called adaptive thermogenesis, or what I would rather call adaptive thermoreduction, which we can define as changes in resting metabolic rate beyond what can be predicted by changes in lean body mass. So the adaptive thermoreduction component is consistent with hypocaloric conditions and weight loss. The adaptive thermogenesis component, which would be apparent in weight gain scenarios and caloric surpluses, that seems to be fully explainable by increases in total body mass and increases in lean body mass and the energy cost of that, as well as the increased energy cost of just consuming more food. So there is sort of this asymmetric phenomenon with adaptive thermogenesis versus adaptive thermoreduction. And so trying to explain that right there, what I just rattled off, I would probably need a PowerPoint presentation and some diagrams and stuff like that. And so it's extremely complex and tough to explain to people over the phone. And it's certainly hard to explain to the layperson who doesn't necessarily have a concept of the different components of energy expenditure that we're talking about. So, yes, well, that's that. I'm going to.
No, that was great.
I'm going to shut up for a second.
But the reason why I started this conversation the way I did is I just want to impress upon our audience, our fine audience, that it isn't that simple. it depends. My favorite word for many years, as I think you may recall, was context. And I'll fast forward that to where I am now. Rather than just context or the ability to differentiate context, ultimately is the relevance of this stuff. And one needs to appreciate that researchers, scientists are, they're dealing for a good reason in a very reductionist, process. They're trying to answer a very specific question. They need to get rid of all those things that can confound that can contaminate their ability to try and find this, the answer to a particular question. That question isn't really a real world thing. It is looking at a mechanism. It's looking at a very particular thing. And if you're talking about how much protein an individual needs, well, it depends. What question are we talking about? Are we talking about muscle protein synthesis? That doesn't necessarily mean muscle protein hypertrophy. It doesn't necessarily mean it's going to result in satiation. It's not going to necessarily result in a favorable body composition. It may result in a favorable body composition aesthetically, but may not be functionally for my athletes, for example. So there's a lot that comes of that. And I think that you've done a really good job of explaining there to us that this stuff is pretty complex. And yes, people will have different perspectives, particularly researchers will have very well-informed perspectives, but it's very much focused on their particular area of research at that time. And it's not meant to necessarily translate holistically to everyone's needs at any given time. It's never going to be a panacea, which is where I think, your average Joe in the gym or whoever across the table at the dinner table isn't necessarily going to understand all of that. They've just got that, well, protein is the solution to every problem known to man, but it has to be from a plant source or, whey protein all the way. I remember conversations with people I've had. Yeah, but the reason why whey is superior, one of the reasons why we're so into whey is because that's where most of the research has been done. In terms of statistical significance, yes, you can argue that one kind of protein is more superior than other on a very basic level, but you might achieve fairly decent results if you're not elite necessarily as an athlete. I mean, it just depends on what you're trying to do. How meaningful is it actually in the real world, as I think is where people tend to struggle, because there's a lot of shit we all have to do. Whether you're just trying to get in some general nutrition to look after your basic health requirements. In fact, to stop me going off on my own rants on this stuff, because I can feel rants just coming on. Let's just dial this back to the word diet then, right? Because we're talking about some science here and some really complex stuff, but holistically, people eat food, right? And there's different kinds of foods, and collectively we might call that a diet. But a diet means more than just eating a bunch of foods. Dieting can also mean I'm on a diet. So in terms of a favorable outcome, most people are thinking about undertaking a diet because they want to lose weight. They want to look great. We live in a society where, rightly or wrongly, achieving a lean, trim physique is seen as being more attractive or whatever. I mean, there's different people have different perspectives. I completely get that, but it is a pretty common perspective is I want to lose weight. And one reason for losing weight is they want to feel better about themselves. They want to look better for other reasons. A huge amount of your life as a researcher and as a practitioner has focused on this concept of diets and their potential for having a positive impact on body composition. I.e., you can do the wrong thing and it's not going to get you the right outcome. Therefore, Alan has spent an awful lot of time working out what actually works, what is actually relevant in a variety of different contexts. So let's explore a little bit of that, Alan. There are different types of diets and there's different eating styles, and they can all have varying effects on body composition. And then you have to read consensus paper or get into all sorts of publications that you come up with to get into that. But why is it important for us to tease out all these different characteristics of a diet if all we're trying to do basically is just get into an energy deficit. I mean, why? Why do we need to even bother with this stuff?
I think it's important to bother with this stuff because people need to understand that these are just different roads to the same place. They're just different roads to Rome. When people are trying to diet, as long as they understand that it's a matter of sustaining a net caloric deficit over quite a long time, then we can begin to stay productive about individualizing the approach towards that. So some people may prefer a linear type of diet where you incur the same deficit every day, whereas others may prefer to feel like they're not dieting for some of the time, and therefore, your deficit would be incurred on anywhere from, let's say, 1 to 3 days out of the week, where you're restricting your food intake. Both of those work. Conventional daily caloric restriction works just as well as any number of the intermittent fasting models, as long as you're comparing diets of an equal net deficit by the end of the week. Of course, there's pros and cons to each approach. There's this sort of numbing grind with the daily caloric restriction that some people feel and don't like. With intermittent fasting type of models, whether it's time restricted feeding within the day or whether it's some sort of variant of whole day fasting like the 5-2 model or alternate day fasting, there's potential cons with that approach, depending on just how passionate somebody is about maintaining a schedule that's flexible and congruent with the rest of the world, as well as maximally retaining lean body mass. There's some issues there with, for example, alternate day fasting. Resistance training does tend to mitigate a lot of the risks with intermittent fasting and the threat of lean mass loss. And intermittent fasting is indeed one of the breakthroughs over the last 10 years that we've been able to see is a viable option for people who prefer it. But when people start deifying certain diet paradigms, like saying everybody has to fast, everybody has to intermittently fast, or everybody has to cinch down their feeding window to 8 hours or less in order to be maximally healthy or get maximal results, all of that's a load of baloney. You get the big rocks straight, which is a well-constructed diet in terms of food selection and macronutrient targets, micronutrient targets by default of the quality of your diet. And then the way that you consume that diet in the course of the week, whether it looks linear or whether it's up and down or whether it's cinched in feeding windows or whatnot, all of that can be individualized to the person's preferences and goals. All of that can be individualized. And so this brings me to the concept, Laurent, that what I just said is not this simple magic bullet. This is the single way to do it. But unfortunately, we as humans, we have a tendency to want to know what is the single best universal way I need to do this. Simplify it for me. The answer is, look, it's your personal damn preference. I'll simplify it by saying, hit your protein goals, hit your calorie goals, get a reasonably healthy food selection, and then do it. The rest of it, just individualize it towards what is your actual goal, whether it be performance or whether it be body composition. And then we take it from there.
But a biggie, though, isn't it, is, as you said, the road to Rome. There are different roads, but they've all got to head in the right direction in order to get you there. And that right direction is a shared characteristic, which is, for argument's sake, true north, right? And the true north on this journey is the sustained caloric deficit, right?
Yeah.
So why does everyone struggle with that?
It's almost too it's too abstract, I think. for a lot of people. And it goes against people's preconceived idea that there must be some sort of one best way, or it doesn't align with what people have listened to their favorite doctor or their favorite guru say. And then they may latch on to certain principles. They may get an emotional attachment to, let's say, the idea that intermittent fasting, it elevates autophagy. This really interesting concept of autophagy, where we're getting rid of damaged and toxic cellular components, right? Autophagy, we got to crank that up. Oh, so therefore I need to go through these fasting periods. Well, a lot of people, they'll latch onto that, and they'll honestly think that they need to go through a 3-day fast, like once a month or whatever it is, or they need to, for sure, make sure their fasting periods are at least 16 hours a day. Otherwise, they're not getting their autophagy benefits. All of that is totally false. All of it is totally false. Exercise increases autophagy, and resistance exercise increases autophagy. So with something like exercise, if you were to chase autophagy, chase it with exercise, because at least exercise is the win-win, where you're preserving lean body mass as well as sustaining your caloric deficit. Whereas chasing autophagy with just not eating can be a win-lose in terms of preserving lean body mass and proper fueling for the goal of becoming more fit while you get leaner. And so there are a lot of people out there who are genuinely convinced that they need to diet a certain way because some doctor said so. And a lot of people are unaware that that is just a complete load of baloney.
But we have belief re-entering the conversation again, don't we? And it's one of those things that it's unbelievably powerful as a driver. Literally historically you hear stories of people, going over a cliff because they believe in whatever. Metaphorically in this case, they're doing all sorts of things that end up resulting in degrees of self-sabotage to an extent that is just utterly bonkers. They're in a perpetual path of going the opposite direction to Rome. And the result of that will be all the demons that come to them, the disappointment and all the things that will stimulate their bad behaviors, the sort of the self-soothing that us humans are so good at, whether it's alcohol or chocolate or cookies or whatever. And it's like one of the words that you use, going totally YOLO, as you like to say, is an interesting sort of bump. And there are many bumps in this path to Rome. So although the shared characteristic is this sustained calorie deficit of whatever, we can talk about that in a minute, it's the various things that can sabotage that journey that I certainly see as being the biggest problem, where belief gets them over some of those challenges. So whether it's, I'm going to stop eating carbs because carbs are evil, it's quite simple for me to understand. If I don't eat evil, therefore I'm going to end up in a happy place, until they find out that actually isn't going to work. Particularly if they're athletes, the consequence of that is, of course, they're not getting the fuel that they need to power them through their training sessions and so on. And it's a little easier in some respects, or easy is maybe not the right phrase, but for people who aren't having to deal with highly functional demands from their day-to-day work, i.e. training, having matches, games, events, competitions, it takes them longer to discover that what they're doing, they're going down the wrong path, if we're going to stick with that metaphor. And I think one particularly interesting sort of sabotaging mechanism, well, there's several, but one that, again, I've heard you talk about before, and I went and did loads of research on this concept of collateral fattening, which is really interesting, is there are scenarios where people will go completely the other way, rather than not, reducing their caloric intake sufficiently to bring about a sustained caloric deficit over a reasonable time period. They go the other way, where they start losing muscle mass because they've gone through a diet of completely going crazy with their caloric restriction. Could you just talk us through that a bit? Because that is something that I do see, particularly with active people. The result is pretty awful when you find yourself losing muscle mass, but the mechanisms that then drives them to do what they do. Just talk about that a little bit.
So collateral fattening, if we were to kind of simplify the process and the concept, is at the beginning, the body's strongest drive is to just survive, to stay alive and defend against survival threats. And so the body sees or senses losses in lean mass, changes in energy expenditure, changes in body composition, period. It sees them as threats to survival. So any sort of oncoming change to the status quo, physiological status quo, the body will raise its defenses against. And in the case of loss of lean body mass, the body senses a profound energy crisis. And in the process of dieting, if you diet too quickly, too drastically, aggressively, and certainly if you prolong the process, and at the end of the dieting cycle, you've lost a lot of lean body mass. And granted, losing some lean body mass is inevitable for some people, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. But a lot of people will just lose too much lean body mass in the process. And at the end of the dieting cycle, then you have a more raging hunger profile, higher appetite. At the end of the dieting cycle, when you've lost a lot of lean body mass and the body just simply wants to do what it takes to influence your physiology and your behavior to eat back that lean body mass any which way but loose and as soon as possible. And so the typical scenario is people just overeat and they overshoot the amount of total calories that it takes to regain that lean body mass. So while they're regaining lean body mass, they're gaining a bunch of body fat in addition to it. So a solution to preventing that scenario where at the end of the dieting cycle, your raging hunger drives you to overeat and regain all the lean mass, but even more body fat. The solution to doing this is to keep your lean body mass while you're dieting. And the way that you do that is two main things, which would be to make sure that the caloric deficit is not too aggressive. And make sure that, and the way that you do that is you make sure you're consuming enough calories and making sure you're consuming enough protein to preserve lean body mass. And of course, make sure resistance training is in place to preserve that lean body mass in the dieting process. And in practical terms, it really comes down to limiting weekly weight loss to roughly 1% of your total body weight per week. Once you go beyond 1% loss of total body weight per week, then you start getting into risky territory with whether or not you're going to retain that lean body mass. And I think that as a community, we tend to look at the wrong population when we start putting rapid fat loss up on a pedestal. Now, I understand Bill Campbell, my friend and colleague Bill Campbell, he's in the process of publishing or wrapping up and getting finally to publication his study on rapid fat loss, which is a drastic caloric deficit for a short period of time that still preserves lean body mass, and you get the hell out of there, and then you go back to your routine. So anyway, barring that, I think that, okay, the body of literature on obese individuals, or if I were to be politically correct, individuals living with obesity, that's the politically correct way to say it. Highly ineloquent, but that's, person first language is it is what it is. So in populations with obesity, they have a very favorable profile with rapid fat loss at the outset. But then again, they're a very different population because they have the energy stores to spare, to the point that the body doesn't necessarily cross over and dip into lean body mass at the beginning of a program in order to fuel the process. Now, if you look at lean athletic populations, and then you apply this sort of rapid fat loss, very low calorie paradigm to them, sure, they're going to lose fat, but they're also going to lose a lot more lean body mass. And so the leaner you are, the more careful you need to be about rapid weight loss, and the more mindful you need to be about proactively limiting the amount of weight you lose per given unit of time. And as far as we can tell, it's roughly about 1% per week that you want to kind of be mindful of. And sure, there are some people who will lose more quickly than that and still retain their lean mass, but just as a general heuristic, that's what we're looking at. Because otherwise, then this collateral fattening phenomenon can happen where you do lose a bunch of lean body mass. The body raises its hunger hormones and suppresses satiety hormones on a kind of a chronic basis. And then you just experience this overeating and overgain of body fat.
So, Alan, there are so many rabbit holes we could go down here. And you cover all of this in your books and papers, other podcasts and so on. That, some of the stuff I want to get into here is some of the things that maybe aren't covered in those areas in maybe as much detail, particularly in other conversations that you have. But I think there's one area, we keep talking about losing weight, body composition, and so on. Now, this isn't actually that easy to assess. People make an assumption, I lost, no, let's reverse that. I gained weight. The assumption is that they've gained body fat. That's just where the mind goes. Damn it, I've gained weight. But actually assessing this stuff so that you can, have a grip on what's actually happening is pretty tricky. Even in the laboratory setting, there's all sorts of stuff there that makes these gold standard techniques maybe gold plated rather than gold standard, particularly from whether you're a recreational athlete, elite athlete, whatever. We all have the same issue here. Assessing where you're at and tracking progress. What is your advice on that and your concern? What are your thoughts, Alan?
Okay, I think people need to understand that when we, in quotes, measure body composition, we're not really measuring it. We're estimating it. We're predicting it. We're taking an educated guess. So even the so-called gold standard methods have these error margins that are sometimes wider than somebody's rate of weekly or monthly progress. And so that casts a lot of doubt on how much stock we can put into the numbers that are spit out by the various devices. There's a 4-compartment model. There's even a 5-compartment model. People don't have access to these types of methods unless you're at a university lab. But even then, look, the 4-compartment model is a set of assumptions. Anyway, you're still not actually directly measuring body composition.
So not in people that are alive. Anyway, that's the issue there, right?
That's the big issue. And so the solution would be to just be consistent with the method that you choose and be mindful of the reality that it is an educated guess. And it's a lot more practical and realistic to look at monthly changes as holding the weight rather than daily or weekly changes, which can be a lot more erratic. Interestingly, something as archaic as skin fold measurements, just as valid as getting somebody to a DEXA scan as far as just tracking progress goes. And you just pick the method that is economically and logistically feasible for the individual, stay
I've got
consistent.
my skin fold calipers here, by the way. Just people.
Oh, you got the big.
Some people don't even. You see, look, there you go. You check your. I'll do it. Do you remember the old Poliquin cheek measurement?
Absolutely.
Yeah. These are in my office. Just since you mentioned it, Alan, I thought I would.
I love it.
Get the tools out.
No, that is that's the big daddy, the Harpenden, I believe.
Harpendens, yes.
Harpendens, yeah. Mm-hmm. No, those are like, they deserve like a display case with the light shining on it, man. That's a legendary piece of assessment.
Just equipment. It's true, a little applied tip. Sorry, now that I told you there'd be some rabbit holes. So particularly here in Scotland, it gets a little cold from time to time. I have to warm these babies up, because when I stick them on athletes when they're cold, they get a little, you get decked by some 10-foot rugby player. It's not that great. Sorry, I completely distracted you, but that's that's an issue that we haven't even discussed in the methods and use of some of these tools, is they're just damn uncomfortable.
Very true. Very true. But it's just the consistency of the method, really, that you're using, and just kind of knowing the, in general, the strengths and limitations of the method when you're looking at the bigger picture of progress and what's happening. With skin fold calipers, unlike other methods, hydration, food content, and all that stuff, it's not really going to affect it as much as it would affect like something like bioelectrical impedance or DEXA.
Yeah.
And it's just a very sort of bottom line physical measurement. And when the technician is skilled at it,
Well, that was where I was about to say. The thing is with things like skin folds, skill is required. I mean, where you take the measurements matters. As your body changes, the geography, if you like, the topography of the body changes, and that will influence where you take your measurements from. It can get pretty complicated. And I think you said the magic word earlier about the strength and limitations of the tools, strength and limitations of your knowledge. And these are the sorts of things that I'm trying to throw light on. A lot of our listeners here they've gonna have heard a lot of this stuff before, but they haven't necessarily thought about the pitfalls, the gaps that exist, not just in their knowledge, in your knowledge, my knowledge, the importance of things like relevance. And in fact, I've got a couple of quotes that I like to sort of throw out at times like this, in that it's not just about go on a diet because it works, or go on low carb, or go on high protein. Performance of and recovery from sporting activities are enhanced by well-chosen nutrition strategies. And that's a really important concept for people to bear in mind. But also, determining which strategy to use depends on the specific goals of the individual, and there is no method or diet that will address all needs of an individual in all situations, right? And then to quote Asker Ukendrup, who will be on this podcast soon, therefore, appropriate practical application lies in the optimal combination of different nutritional training methods. And all I'm trying to illustrate there is that on this path to Rome that we've talked about, yes, there are some common things, like we've got to approach, this sustained caloric deficit. That how long we have to sustain that deficit for is obviously going to depend on how much you want to lose in terms of body fat, how fast you want to achieve it, and how many bumps there are going to be in the road that we've talked about. Is it going to result in collateral, damage there, collateral fattening? You've got all kinds of metabolic adaptations that might result in, you're going to burn off all your calories in your workout, but then you've reduced all of your fidgeting for the rest of the day as a compensatory mechanism. Or the behavioral response, like in collateral fattening, is you've burnt it off, but now you're going to eat it all back. There's a lot to it that people don't appreciate. But if people get that in mind, and they've got their head around what they feel is the most comfortable path that they want to follow to Rome, to their optimal body composition, there is that thing that I've just referred to is well, how much and how fast those are the sort of metrics. And you've already referred to this a little bit about a certain percentage of body weight in a certain time frame. You can come up with all sorts of metrics with how much protein, there's a minimum. I know you have, let's say 1.7, for example, is a number that comes out for some people. But I mean, there's all sorts of things, Alan. For you, there's a couple of critical things that are going to get them to Rome. What are they going to be?
Total daily protein, caloric deficit, inclusion of a sound resistance training program. And I know you said a couple things, but the number 4 would be an understanding that in the long term, if you do have a lot of body fat to lose, let's say you do have significantly more than 10% of your total body weight to lose, then you're really going to want to cozy up to the idea that it may involve some maintenance periods or some diet breaks, breaks from the caloric deficit. And we've seen this in practice. Taking diet breaks is a beneficial thing. There was a lot of hype around diet breaks back in the 20 years back, where people were saying, oh yeah, it's benefits metabolism and all this stuff. But over time, over the direct measurement of metabolism and what happens with dieting and things. And there's even a couple of recent systematic reviews. One is a meta-analysis on diet breaks. Neither of them indicate a meaningful metabolic advantage or metabolic protection of a diet break paradigm versus a linear caloric deficit with no diet break paradigm. But the literature in aggregate shows that diet breaks don't hinder the fat loss process, aside from the extra time that they take while you're on a diet break. There has been a lot of speculation that diet breaks might preserve resting metabolic rate better than not taking any diet breaks. But that ends up not being completely true, especially in programs that involve a resistance training component. So when a resistance training component is in play, there really is no meaningful rescuing of resting metabolic rate decreases from dieting if you're going to be taking intermittent diet breaks. So once again, this sort of diet break paradigm is a little bit more of a psychological respite or benefit, more than it is a metabolic benefit. So if you can improve long-term dietary adherence, even if you're not getting some sort of metabolic benefit from the diet break, you're getting a psychological benefit, then that can be a big deal, and that can be an important tool as well. And there's kind of a concept to raise that people need to understand if they do have a lot of body weight to lose. Once again, let's say 10% of total body weight or more, you need to lose that. You have to understand that it's okay to go through prolonged maintenance phases, because the ultimate goal down the line is maintenance of some sort of favorable body composition. So it's totally okay for maintenance phases to eventually get longer than the actual dieting phases. Everybody wants to just diet straight through and go hard, but people need to embrace the concept that hitting plateaus, energetic equilibrium, is just the body doing its job, and it's okay to execute what I call maintenance practice in these plateaus, because it's a legitimate goal to maintain progress that you've made. And it's a challenging goal to maintain progress that you made and not just try to push forward. And instituting these diet breaks can be a powerful tool for adherence. I know you asked me what are the 2 things, and I just rattled off 4 things.
No, that's cool. I got two bonuses there. I'm a lucky guy. Listen, I mean, a lot of people that I work with, and a lot of people I think will be listening to my podcast, are going to be those people that are already exercising. They're already active. they are maybe in the gym or they're running or they're athletes, they're already on that. But I think it's worth just briefly mentioning just how important that aspect is, because in nutrition, we talk about food, we talk about energy, calories, macros, or whatever. We're not necessarily talking about muscle, the importance of stimulating muscle, getting adaptations from muscle, which brings us to the whole value of the training stimulus. It's like the chicken or the egg. We can't really have one conversation without bearing in mind the other. Just your thoughts on, in fact, I've got one of these little muscle things, and just because I happen to have them, but you've seen loads of these things, they do the rounds. Although interestingly, I got this one from a medical school, and a lot of people will have you believe that there's a vast difference between a pound of muscle and a pound of fat, but actually they're very similar, which I thought was rather interesting. But being muscle centric, getting this pound of muscle, which actually is quite a lot. How important is that, particularly when we're talking about bringing about favorable changes in body composition? Why do we still need to be keeping muscle in the mind?
Well, we can look at muscle as the active metabolic engine of the body. I mean, we have resting metabolic rate. We have various organ systems that are energetically expensive to just exist. But it's really our skeletal muscle that we can command and control to essentially dictate our healthy metabolic state or unhealthy metabolic state, whether we're on a decline or whether we're maintaining our, in quotes, healthy metabolism. And skeletal muscle is going to be the fuel furnace of the body. And so when we lose our, in quotes, metabolic engine, then things just start to go really bad from both a lean tissue standpoint, fat tissue standpoint. Just things like our skeletal health goes down as well if we're losing muscle, and that is the tendency. Like after the age of 40 in the general population, people start losing 0.5% up to 1% of their muscle mass
That's
a year.
Frightening, man, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a brutal thing, and these values only escalate in people's 50s and 60s. And so, since there is that tendency, that use it or lose it tendency, it's not even a tendency; it's a certainty. If you don't use your muscle, you will lose it. The body sees it as kind of expensive to keep on. And when you look at the tissue-specific energy expenditure of the various components of the body, when people will point to muscle only burning like 6 to 10 calories a day per pound, but the amount of caloric cost to increase muscle mass and maintain that increased muscle mass, and the increased caloric cost of movement once you've increased that muscle mass, and the increased caloric requirement of escalating volumes of training required to increase muscle mass or maintain a high degree of muscle mass. That's a whole lot more than that 6 to 10 calories per pound per day. So that's how I would attempt to answer the question, Laurent.
Yeah, well, no, you did great. Look, I throw crazy questions sometimes, and that's because there isn't necessarily a direct answer for some of these things, because it depends, right? There's a lot of things that one has to consider, and like I said, I'm just trying to delve into aspects of your thinking that aren't necessarily the normal questions. So listen, look, we could talk for hours, and there's so much that I haven't asked that I would love to ask, but we don't have time for that. But
go for it. Just one more. Give me one more doozy. We got to do this for the social media. Social media, they need this stuff.
Well, okay. So there is all this controversy out there about low carb diets, ketogenic diets, and there's a lot of people who are pretty damn religious about this stuff. We've already explained that there's different ways of achieving that. But, at the beginning of this conversation, we I made a point of saying that a lot of your perspective and mine comes from looking at the evidence. It isn't a personal bias. It's like, well, this shit works because it works. This is what the science says. This is what the evidence says. So if we're going to come from that perspective, you nobody's throwing any money at you for mentioning a particular brand or there's no magic thing here that you're coming up with other than the evidence. If you were a betting man and you had to throw everything into one thing, what's it going to be in terms of a couple of key bits of advice that our listeners, and bearing in mind they're active, to get those rapid results for that optimal body composition? What's their new religion, their new belief going to be, Alan?
The way that I answer that is that none of the details matter if you cannot sustain the program. There are different scenarios. There are different it depends types of scenarios. I have experienced clients who need to look a certain way within 6 weeks for a movie part, for example. I've had many clients who need to look a certain way within 4 months because they're going to step on stage. Us outside of those scenarios, those time crunched scenarios, people have to just realize that it's okay to take a full year to undo the body composition damage, the fat gain, the muscle loss that you incurred over the last 10 to 20 years of being a working adult. It's okay to take a year to undo your bad stuff. So I think from that standpoint, it really comes down to just getting the big rocks, the fundamentals straight. And I may sound like a broken record, but a reasonably healthy food selection that comprises a diet with adequate macronutritional targets and, of course, adequate micronutrition for health. I'm not a stickler for very specific foods across the food groups. A lot of them have overlapping benefits. But, truly, aside from that, and I'm not somebody who's going to make everybody track every gram of protein, carbohydrate, and fat, and track every calorie. There's a spectrum of what people favor and what they can tolerate with respect to the degree of micromanagement of the program. Some people it drives them absolutely insane. And some people should never in their life weigh a food. Some people should never in their life enter grams and calories into an app. But, there's a spectrum of tolerance for that. And sometimes you need to pull those tools out in order to bring people over to reality. But just the super basic, boring stuff is what people need to realize. If you want to gain weight, caloric surplus and resistance training. If you want to lose weight, caloric deficit and resistance training. Both sides, the faster it happens, the greater the risk to either fat gain on the surplus side or muscle loss on the deficit side. And then you go into the weeds from there, different types of protein, animal versus plant protein, distribution at even training types, training volume. There's so many things to go in there. But like with the training world, it's like if your goal is to maintain your muscle mass, and it's not a particularly extraordinary degree of muscle mass, then the minimum effective dose is surprisingly low for resistance training. On the other end of the spectrum, if you want to maintain an extraordinary level of muscle mass, then the volume goes up quite a bit. And so honestly, I hate to say this, Laurent, but I think the big answer to what you asked is it freaking depends on the individual goal and situation.
Yeah, no, look, I know. I have done, and this new podcast is, episodes are going to be specifically about all those little nuanced areas. It's just going to be a whole hour or two just about plant protein or whatever. I mean, it's going to be one of those things. So listen, there is one question actually, because I think this is something you're really good at, is, you know, in this path to Rome, there's a lot of paths that are mined, and you know, there are going to be red flags that people need to recognize. There's a whole lot of stuff out there that is just, it's either quackery or it's deliberately misleading. It's going to lead you down a path of misery. What are the sort of red flags that immediately stand out? What are the things that, you know, if you had to prime your kids, your friends, your partners, what's that going to be? What are the red flags? Their instant survival toolkit from Alan Aragon to just not step on these dietary landmines. What are they going to be?
Anybody who promotes a single diet paradigm as the one that everybody should do. A common example is people who say that everybody should be fasting, or everybody should be doing, let's pick a diet paradigm, keto. And of course, you're going to have people saying everybody should be doing fasting plus keto. That is out there. And while these things work, if you were certainly, if you were to get on keto, combine it with just not eating for long periods of time, you're going to lose a hell of a lot of weight, and it's going to happen hella fast. But then the consequences will show themselves when you try to sustain that in the long term. And when you look at the general statistics of diet failure, in other words, the inability to lose 10% or more of your body weight for at least 1 year, it's about 80% of dieters are unsuccessful and they gain their weight back. And one of the reasons is specifically because they follow some guru who says, everybody's got to do my diet. Everybody's got to do keto or fasting or whatever the paradigm is. That's a big red flag. That's a big red flag. What you want to look for in what somebody says is you have to individualize your diet. Make sure you incur an energy deficit, reasonable macro targets, and reasonable food selection. But you have to incur an energy deficit that's not so aggressive that adverse things happen and that you cannot sustain it. So how unsexy is that, though? Wouldn't you rather, like, it's much more high impact if I say, calories don't count. Fasting is the key. Counting calories doesn't work. You know, that sort of thing. It's like, let's look at the literature and see what the evidence is on that kind of thing. And so another red flag, well, this is not necessarily a principle. It's just a very specific example. Anytime somebody obsesses over a single physiological process and blames it for the ills of humanity, like, for example, transient blood glucose elevations. Some people will
glucose spikes.
Some people will build their brand around just a normal physiological process. What they'll do, they'll create a problem that doesn't exist, and then they'll sell a solution to this non-existing problem, and then they'll profit from it. That is really extremely annoying, dude. Like, the propagation of this idea, it really is. It really is. And look, there are certain populations that benefit from obsessing over their glucose spikes. They sure are. Type 2 diabetics, type 1 diabetics, some people who don't have neurotic tendencies and obsessive tendencies who want to engage in continuous glucose monitor out of suspicion that they may be pre-diabetic. Okay, fine, I'll grant you that.
Well, Alan, I mean, here's a shock to most people. If your glucose didn't spike under some of those circumstances, then you'd be in serious trouble.
Serious trouble.
Yeah. Yeah, it's supposed to spike, folks. It's more complicated. And I guess it's the limitations to an individual's understanding of just how much knowledge they have to understand this stuff. All they do is they speak basic English of that language, right? They speak enough to recognize, oh, there's a spike in my glucose. They know that glucose is sugar, and a spike, they've assumed that there's a problem there, but it isn't. So, yep.
Yeah, another big red flag. I have to cover this big red flag.
Please.
People who preach, and this is outside of the context of nutrient timing for exercise performance. This is outside of that context. This is in the dieting and health context. When people preach that you need to adhere to a specific feeding window, it's usually 8 hours or less. That's a red flag. When people preach that this feeding window needs to be at a specific point in the day, the darling now is early time restricted feeding. That's a red flag.
Don't eat after 6 p.m.
Yeah. Or 4, even better, 4. Just skip dinner completely. That's a red flag. Another red flag, of course, is, when people combine the two, you got to skip breakfast and skip dinner so you can really minimize that feeding window. That utter nonsense. Another red flag, when people say you cannot eat certain foods or macronutrients at a given time in the day. Like when people preach the evils of eating carbohydrate in the evening, or some people will preach the evils of eating carbohydrate front-loaded. But right now, the academic literature is beginning to fawn over front-loaded carbohydrate intake. Still baloney, still missing the forest for the trees, still focusing on the grains of sand and missing the big rocks. Those are red flags. So I just had to get that in there.
No, thank you. That's exactly what I want people to hear. I want them to think. It might be cool. It might be trendy. It might be extremely sexy. Listen, Alan, look, it's been awesome to talk to you. You're just a huge amount of information. I don't know how you managed to keep up with all the knowledge that there is out there. I'll put in the notes, there'll be access to your all the numerous open access publications. That's one of the great things that, by the way, that you do is most of your you could choose all sorts of journals to publish your work through, impact factor and all that. But your impact is particularly broad and wide because people are actually able to read those papers. So I'll put links to those because you don't have to pay you don't have to be in university to get library access to these things. And then there's your great flexible dieting book, but also wanted to mention your research review that I have myself benefited from over time. I think if you're worrying about how to interpret information, how to recognize landmines, a lot of the stuff is going to come down to your ability to tease out the quality from the flawed information, how to think, how to interrogate, how to be, yes, skeptical, but open-minded, but not so much that your head falls off and all that sort of thing. Being in things like journal clubs, but with a mentor, is a really important process. And your research review is a particularly effective way of doing that. So I highly recommend listeners engage with that. And we'll put a link to that. But just listen to Alan, read what he's got to say. And thank you. I really appreciate that chat and hearing what you got to say, mate.
Laurent, as you've tried to teach me how to pronounce it.
Come on. I haven't taught you very well.
Laurent. Jeez, I'm just not good at it. I appreciate what you bring to the industry. You are an absolute shining beacon in the industry and so incredibly humble about it too. I'm glad to see that you've succeeded to the level that you have over the years, decades maybe. And looking forward to seeing you continue to be such a leader in the space. So thank you again.
Thank you, Alan. That actually means a lot to me. It really does. So thank you for saying that. I'm not so good at pushing myself out there, but I appreciate that. Well, look, I've enjoyed it. To be honest, the fact that people are listening is just a bonus. I managed to get a one-on-one chat with you for this period of time, and if other people benefit from that chat, then we've really we've managed to do something great here. A little bit of sexiness. I don't know. We'll see.
Try.
We'll see. We'll try it. You take care of yourself, Alan, and I'll see you soon.
Thank you so much, sir.